We begin, as we so often do, at the end of everything a woman has known. Thessaly Rourke was 34 years old when she stood at a crossroads outside Larkspur Hollow, Montana Territory, with $11 sewn into the hem of her petticoat and nowhere on earth that would call itself her home. It was her husband's own brother, Silas Rourke, who put her out, not with his hands, for he was not a violent man, but with a signature on a paper that made the homestead his and made her, in the eyes of the law, a guest who had overstayed her welcome. Daniel had been dead only 11 weeks, taken by a lung fever that swept the valley that spring, and Silas had wasted no more than a season's mourning before he told her, gently enough, that a widow with no children and no deed had no true claim to land that bore his family's name. She left with a trunk, a shawl, and those $11, and when she passed through the middle of town 2 days later and saw the old, blackened Icehouse standing crooked and forgotten behind the feed store, its door hanging by one hinge, she did something that made the men on the porch of the mercantile laugh behind their hands. She paid $5 for it. $5 for a ruin nobody wanted, in a town that had already decided she was a fool for staying. But what she did not know, what none of them knew, was that sealed high in the rafters of that condemned little building was a secret that would not only save her, but would settle a debt the whole town had been quietly bleeding from for 11 long years. Settle in, and let us tell you the story of Thessaly Rourke. If you have ever been told that what you carry is worth nothing, that the thing you hold on to is foolishness and nothing more, tell us in the comments where you are watching from tonight. We have a feeling you already know how this story ends before it even begins. Thessaly had not always been a woman who counted coins by candlelight. She was raised the daughter of a cooper in Ohio, a man named Amos Vane, no relation, as fate would idly have it, to the banker who would later loom over her life like a long winter shadow. And from him, she learned two things that would matter more than any inheritance ever could. The first was the discipline of her hands, how to read the grain of a piece of wood before you cut it, how to fit a stave so tight that water could not find its way between the seams, how patience, applied correctly and without complaint, could make something whole out of what looked like scraps. The second thing Amos Vane taught his daughter was harder to name, but easier to feel, and it was this: that a thing's worth was never fixed by the price a careless man was willing to pay for it. He used to tell her, turning a barrel slowly in his big scarred hands, that the difference between rubbish and treasure was very often nothing more than somebody willing to look twice. She carried that lesson through her girlhood the way other daughters carried hope chests, and when she married Daniel Rourke at 19 and followed him west to Montana Territory, she carried it still, folded into the deepest part of her the way her mother had once folded lavender into good linen, so that even years later, everything she touched still smelled faintly of home. Daniel Rourke was not a wealthy man, but he was a kind one, and their years together on the homestead outside Larkspur Hollow were not easy years, but they were good ones. He raised cattle in a modest way and helped his neighbors more than he helped himself, and Thessaly, for her part, became known, quietly, the way such reputations are built, as a woman who could fix nearly anything that was broken and see value in nearly anything that was cast off. She mended fences and mended harness leather and, more than once, mended the spirits of women in town who had lost children to fever or husbands to the mountains, sitting with them in silence until silence was no longer unbearable. She never had children of her own, a private grief she did not often speak of, and in later years she would come to feel that perhaps this grief had been preparing her all along to pour her mothering into something larger than one family, into a whole forgotten corner of a town that badly needed tending. She and Daniel built their life together stone by stone, the way you build anything that is meant to last, and if you had asked her in those years what she was most afraid of, she would not have said poverty, and she would not have said loneliness. She would have said she was afraid of being forgotten, of becoming a name nobody troubled to remember, and it is a bitter kind of mercy, looking back on it now, that this very fear was what she would soon overcome, though not in any way she could have imagined. The fever came in the spring of 1887, and it came for Daniel the way a hard frost comes for a garden that had seemed, only the day before, entirely safe. He was 38 years old and strong as a young ox, and within 9 days he was gone, and Thessaly found herself a widow in a country where a widow's claim on anything was only ever as strong as the goodwill of the men around her. That goodwill, in the case of Silas Rourke, proved thin as creek ice in April. Silas had never disliked her, not exactly. He was, by most accounts, simply a practical man in a hard territory, and practical men in hard territories have a way of mistaking their own convenience for the will of Providence. The homestead, he explained to her one evening at the kitchen table that had once been hers to set, had been filed originally under his and Daniel's father's name, and though Daniel had worked it and improved it and loved it, the paper trail, he said again, as though the words themselves were an apology, favored him. He would not see her thrown into the road, he assured her. He offered her a small room in the barn loft and light chores in exchange for her keep, an offer extended with the particular tenderness men reserve for decisions they know, somewhere beneath their practicality, to be unjust. Thessaly looked at him for a long moment, and then she did something that surprised them both. She thanked him for his generosity, gathered what little was undeniably hers, and walked out the door with her chin level and her eyes dry, because she had already decided, somewhere in the 9 days of Daniel's fever, that she would rather be poor and free than sheltered and small. She had $11. She had learned, over the years, never to let anyone know the exact sum of what she carried, and so when she walked into Larkspur Hollow 2 days later, dust-worn and travel-thin, nobody in that town, not Ferris Dunmore at the Mercantile, not the widow Callahan who ran the boarding house, not a soul among them, had any notion that the woman passing through their streets was carrying the whole of her worldly fortune in a hem she had stitched herself by lamplight. She took a room at the boarding house for 2 nights, paying the widow Callahan 50 cents she could not spare, and on the second morning, walking the back lane behind the feed store to clear her head, she came upon the old Icehouse. It had belonged, once, to a cooperative, the Larkspur Ice and Provision Cooperative, as a weathered sign still declared above the door in paint gone the color of a healing bruise. But the cooperative itself had folded some 11 years back, sold off piecemeal, its members scattered or dead or simply worn down by hard winters and harder debts. The Icehouse itself, the last remaining piece of it, had been sitting empty and unclaimed ever since, its double walls and sawdust insulation gone to rot, its roof sagging under years of snow, avoided by children who whispered it was haunted and by adults who simply found it an eyesore not worth the trouble of tearing down. Thessaly stood before it a long while. She noted, the way her father had taught her to note such things, that the timber frame beneath the rot was sound, good tamarack, cut and joined by a careful hand, and that the sagging roof was a matter of a few replaced shingles rather than any true structural failing. She noted, too, that it stood on a corner lot with access to the creek, close enough to town to be useful, far enough to be private. And she thought of her father turning that barrel in his hands, and she thought that perhaps a woman with $11 and 2 strong hands and nowhere else in the world to put either of them might do worse than to own, outright and free and clear, one small forgotten building that nobody else wanted. She found Ferris Dunmore, who held the note on the property on behalf of the town council, and she asked him his price. He laughed, not unkindly, but with the particular condescension men reserve for women who ask questions about property, and told her the town would be glad to be rid of the liability, that he'd take $5 for it, and call it a mercy to both parties. She did not haggle. She counted out 5 silver dollars into his palm right there on the boardwalk, in front of the loafers on the Mercantile porch, and she watched the news of it travel down the street faster than she could walk herself, watched the smiles and the murmurs, watched a woman named Odetta Marsh whisper something behind her hand to her companion that made them both laugh. Thessaly Rourke, they were saying, the widow who lost her husband and her home in the same season, had gone and spent the last of her cents on a haunted icehouse nobody else would touch. Let them laugh, she thought, walking toward her new and ruined property with the last $6 of her fortune tucked once more into her hem. She had learned a long time ago that the opinion of men on a porch had never once put food on a table or a roof over a head, and she had a great deal of work in front of her and very little daylight left to do it in. The first days inside the Icehouse were not glamorous, and we would be doing Thessaly a disservice to pretend otherwise. She swept out a decade of leaves and mouse nests and the brittle bones of birds that had come in through the broken roof and never found their way out again. She pried loose boards free and salvaged what nails she could, straightening each one against a stone with the patience of a woman who understood that a saved nail was a saved nickel, and a saved nickel, to a woman with $6 in the world, was not a small thing. It was on the fourth day, working up on a borrowed ladder to assess the extent of the roof's decay, that she first noticed something curious about the rafters at the northern end of the building, a section of the roof frame that seemed, on close inspection, subtly different from the rest. The other rafters had been cut from tamarack, rough-hewn and honest in their imperfection, but this one section, tucked into the deepest shadow where the roofline met the wall, showed the marks of a finer hand, joints fitted with a care that had nothing to do with holding up a roof and everything to do, she suspected, with holding up something else. She said nothing to anyone. She was not yet certain there was anything to say. She worked the rest of that day patching the more urgent holes against the coming weather, but that night, back in her rented room at the boarding house, she found she could not stop thinking of that oddly careful joinery, tucked away where no casual eye would ever find cause to look. Her father's voice came back to her, as it so often did in moments like this one. The difference between rubbish and treasure was very often nothing more than somebody willing to look twice. The next morning she returned before first light, climbed her ladder again with a lantern in hand despite the risk of fire, for she trusted her own care more than she trusted the sun to rise fast enough, and she began, with the flat edge of a chisel, to work loose the board that did not belong. It came free with a groan of old wood and a fall of dust that made her cough and shut her eyes, and when she opened them and lifted the lantern into the cavity she had uncovered, she found a tin box, rust-spotted but intact, wedged tight between two joists and bound shut, with a strip of oiled leather gone stiff with age. Her hands, she would later admit, shook as she worked the leather free. Inside, wrapped in a square of oilcloth that had done its work well enough to keep the damp at bay, she found a ledger book, its cover worn soft as a glove, and beneath it, folded in a separate cloth, a scattering of coins and what looked, in the lantern's poor light, to be a small quantity of gold dust sealed in a stoppered vial. She did not touch the coins first. She opened the ledger. The handwriting inside was careful and small, the hand of a man who had learned his letters late in life and treasured them all the more for the effort it had cost him. The first page named him Obadiah Finch, founder and first treasurer of the Larkspur Ice and Provision Cooperative, established the 18th of March, in the year of our Lord 1869. Thessaly had heard the name before, in passing, the way one hears the names of the dead in a small town. Obadiah Finch, a freedman who had come north after the war with nothing but his own two hands, who had built the Icehouse himself, board by board, and who had convinced a dozen skeptical Larkspur families to pool their modest savings into a cooperative that would cut ice from the creek each winter and sell it through the hot months, splitting the proceeds fairly among every family who had put in their labor and their trust. The ledger recorded, in that same careful hand, years of harvests and sales, small dividends paid out to widows and struggling farmers alike, a running account of a community that had, for a time, taken care of its own. And then, some pages in, the entries changed in tone. Obadiah Finch had begun to write not of ice and dividends, but of a man named Cornelius Vane. Cornelius Vane, the ledger explained in Obadiah's plain, unhurried hand, had come to Larkspur Hollow in the winter of 1875 as an agent for a distant land and banking concern, and he had set himself, patiently, and without ever raising his voice, to acquiring as much of the valley's water rights and mortgages as a man of modest charm and considerable patience could manage. He had approached the cooperative more than once, offering to buy out its creek access for a price that would have enriched himself considerably and left the cooperative's members with nothing but memories and empty pockets. And each time Obadiah Finch, as treasurer, had refused him on behalf of the membership. The refusals had not been forgotten. In the final entries of the ledger, dated the autumn of 1876, Obadiah wrote with a carefulness that Thessaly could feel, even across 11 years, was closer to fear than his earlier entries had ever been. Vane, he wrote, had begun quietly buying up the personal debts of individual cooperative members, debts owed to the mercantile, to the land office, to the bank itself, and calling them due all at once, a pressure no small farmer or widow could withstand, forcing family after family to sell their shares in the cooperative cheap to him through intermediaries who never spoke his name aloud. Obadiah had seen what was coming. He had gathered, in that final autumn, what remained of the cooperative's communal reserve, the Badwinter Fund, he called it, coin and gold dust set aside over years against exactly the kind of ruin now bearing down on them. And rather than let it fall into Vane's hands along with everything else, he had hidden it, here, in the rafters of the building he himself had raised, along with the ledger that named the debt for what it truly was. Not misfortune, but theft, executed slowly enough to look like nothing at all. The last entry in the book was dated the 2nd of December, 1876, and it was short. Obadiah Finch had written that he intended to travel to the Territorial Land Office in the new year to file a formal complaint against Vane's practices, with the ledger itself as evidence. He never made that journey. He was found dead of what the town coroner recorded as a fall on icy steps, not 3 weeks later, and in the confusion and grief that followed, the cooperative, already hollowed out by Vane's quiet campaign, collapsed within the year. Its remaining assets were absorbed, at pennies on the dollar, into holdings that Thessaly, sitting now on the dusty floor of the Icehouse with the lantern guttering low, understood belonged, even now, to the very same Cornelius Vane, who had gone on to become the most prosperous and most quietly feared man in Larkspur Hollow, a man whose bank held the mortgage on nearly every homestead in the valley, including, she now recalled with a slow and terrible clarity, the homestead that had once been hers and Daniel's, and which now, in the family's ledgers if not yet in Thessaly's understanding, was mortgaged to Vane's bank under Silas Rourke's uncertain and increasingly desperate management. She sat with that knowledge for a long while before she moved. It is a strange thing, we think, to hold in your hands at the same moment both a fortune and a wound, to understand that the very cache of gold that could save you personally was also the record of a wrong done to an entire community, a wrong that had, without her ever knowing it, reached forward across 11 years to touch her own life as well. She did not think, even for a moment, of keeping the gold dust and coin quietly for herself and saying nothing of the ledger. We wish we could tell you this was a difficult decision for her, that she wrestled long with temptation, because such a struggle might make for a more dramatic telling. But the truth, as Thessaly herself would later say, was simpler than that. She had spent her whole life being taught that a thing's true worth was not what it could fetch you alone, but what it could restore, and she understood, sitting there in the cold, in the dust with Obadiah Finch's careful handwriting in her lap, exactly what this discovery was for. She began, in the weeks that followed, moving carefully and telling almost no one, to piece together the wider truth. She visited the Territorial Land Office in the county seat. A 2-day journey she made alone and told the boarding house only that she was visiting a cousin, and there she found records that confirmed what the ledger had implied. A pattern of debt transfers in the mid-1870s, dozens of small mortgages, and personal notes quietly consolidated under corporate names that, traced far enough, all led back to Cornelius Vane. She found, too, the original charter of the Larkspur Ice and Provision Cooperative, still on file, unrepealed and technically, astonishingly, still valid in the eyes of territorial law, since no formal dissolution had ever been properly recorded. Only an informal collapse that Vane's bank had been only too glad to let stand unquestioned for 11 quiet years. She began, carefully, to speak with the old families of Larkspur Hollow, the ones who had been cooperative members back in Obadiah Finch's day, and she found that more than a few of them still harbored a dull, unspoken grief about the way the cooperative had ended, a sense that something had gone wrong that they had never quite had the words or the standing to name. She did not tell them everything, not yet. She was building something. In those weeks, the way her father had taught her to build, checking the grain before she cut, fitting each piece with patience before she trusted the joint to hold weight. It did not take long for Cornelius Vane to notice that a woman he had never troubled to learn the name of was making inquiries at the land office and asking old questions in town that had been quiet for a decade. Vane was, by the standards of Larkspur Hollow, an old man now, silver-haired and soft-spoken, given to expensive coats and a manner so mild it took most people years to understand how thoroughly it had been weaponized. He called on Thessaly himself, one gray afternoon in early autumn, finding her at the Icehouse with sawdust in her hair and a hammer in her hand. And he was, at first, charming in the way such men always are when they still believe charm will be sufficient. He admired her industry. He mentioned, almost in passing, that he understood she had been asking questions about an old, defunct cooperative, and that he would hate to see a woman in her position, a widow, alone, with so little to her name, waste her energies chasing matters long since settled by law and time. When charm did not move her, he tried, more plainly, the language of money, offering to purchase the Icehouse property from her outright at a price 4 times what she had paid, an offer so far beyond the building's evident worth that it told her, more clearly than any ledger could, exactly how much he feared what she might have found in it. She thanked him for his generosity and told him the Icehouse was not for sale. His mild face did not change, but something behind his eyes did, and when he left that afternoon, Thessaly understood that the quiet phase of this conflict had ended. It did not take long for Cornelius Vane to notice that a woman he had never troubled to learn the name of was making inquiries at the land office and asking old questions in town that had been quiet for a decade. Vane was, by the standards of Larkspur Hollow, an old man now, silver-haired and soft-spoken, given to expensive coats and a manner so mild it took most people years to understand how thoroughly it had been weaponized. He called on Thessaly himself, one gray afternoon in early autumn, finding her at the Icehouse with sawdust in her hair and a hammer in her hand, and he was, at first, charming in the way such men always are when they still believe charm will be sufficient. He admired her industry. He mentioned, almost in passing, that he understood she had been asking questions about an old, defunct cooperative, and that he would hate to see a woman in her position, a widow, alone, with so little to her name, waste her energies chasing matters long since settled by law and time. When charm did not move her, he tried, more plainly, the language of money, offering to purchase the Icehouse property from her outright at a price 4 times what she had paid, an offer so far beyond the building's evident worth that it told her, more clearly than any ledger could, exactly how much he feared what she might have found in it. She thanked him for his generosity and told him the Icehouse was not for sale. His mild face did not change, but something behind his eyes did, and when he left that afternoon, Thessaly understood that the quiet phase of this conflict had ended. What followed was not violence, for Vane was not a man who dealt in anything so crude, but it was pressure, applied with the same patient cruelty the ledger had described 11 years before. The widow Callahan, kindly but frightened, told her with real regret that she could no longer extend her room at the boarding house on credit. Ferris Dunmore, who had sold her the Icehouse laughing, now found reasons to be short with her when she came to buy nails and lumber, and told her, uncomfortably, that he'd had a word from the bank about extending credit to certain parties. Silas Rourke, too, felt the pressure, though he did not at first understand its source, when the bank that held his note on the homestead sent a polite but pointed letter reminding him that his payments were, in fact, somewhat behind, and that the bank's patience, while considerable, was not without limit. A letter that arrived, we might note, only days after Cornelius Vane learned that his own late father-in-law's crimes were about to be dragged into daylight by the very woman his family had cast out. It would have been easy, in the face of all this, for Thessaly to lose her nerve. She was, after all, one widow with $6, an unfinished icehouse, and a tin box of evidence, standing against a man who owned half the paper in the valley. But she had spent her whole life learning that patience applied correctly could outlast pressure applied unfairly. And so instead of retreating, she went, quietly, to the one man in the territory whose good opinion Vane could not simply purchase. The circuit judge, a stern and famously incorruptible man named Judge Amos Pruitt, who rode through the county twice yearly to hear cases the local courts could not settle, and who was, as it happened, due to arrive in Larkspur Hollow within the month. She brought him the ledger. She brought him the land office records. She brought, most importantly, 5 of the old cooperative families, gathered quietly over weeks of careful, patient conversation, each of whom had their own half-buried memory of a debt called due too suddenly, a share sold too cheap, a suspicion never voiced because there had been no proof to hang it on, and no woman brave enough to go looking for it. Judge Pruitt, who had seen a great deal of quiet injustice in his years riding circuit through hard country, read Obadiah Finch's careful handwriting from start to finish without once looking up, and when he finally raised his eyes to Thessaly, standing before him in her mended dress with her chin level in the way that had become, by then, simply who she was, he told her that she had brought him not a grievance, but a genuine case of fraud upon a chartered cooperative body, still technically alive in the eyes of the law, and that he intended to hear it in open court the following week. The hearing itself, held in the schoolhouse for want of a proper courtroom, was the talk of Larkspur Hollow for years afterward, and we suspect it is still spoken of today by the grandchildren of those who crowded onto the benches to watch. Cornelius Vane came with his own lawyer, composed and mild as ever, and for a while it seemed his composure might carry the day, until Judge Pruitt asked him, plainly, to account for the chain of debt transfers that traced from a dozen small Larkspur families directly into his bank's holdings in the autumn and winter of 1876, transfers that matched, almost to the week, the entries in a dead man's ledger describing exactly this pattern of coercion. Vane's lawyer objected that a ledger written by a man 11 years dead, found in a rafter, proved nothing at all. But Thessaly had anticipated this, and she called, one by one, the old cooperative members she had spent her weeks quietly gathering, and each of them stood and told, in their own plain words, the story of a debt called due too fast, a share sold too cheap, a fear too large to name at the time. Stories that alone might have been dismissed as bitterness, but that together, corroborating a dead man's careful handwriting point by point, formed a pattern no honest court could wave away. It was Ferris Dunmore, of all people, shamed by his own small complicity and perhaps hoping to make some amends, who finally testified that he had, years back, been quietly instructed by the bank which debts to press and which to let lie, a testimony that broke the case wide open, for it proved intention where before there had only been coincidence. Judge Pruitt's ruling took the better part of 2 days to prepare and less than 10 minutes to read aloud, but what it did in those 10 minutes reshaped the valley. He found that the Larkspur Ice and Provision Cooperative had never been lawfully dissolved and remained, under its original charter, a valid legal body, with Thessaly Rourke, as the Icehouse's current owner and the recovered ledger's custodian, recognized as its rightful acting trustee. He ordered an accounting of every debt Vane's bank had acquired through the pattern of coercion described in the testimony, and where fraud could be shown, he ordered those debts voided outright, restoring, among others, the note on the Rourke homestead to a fair and manageable sum, a ruling that struck Silas Rourke, sitting stunned in the schoolhouse benches, with the particular vertigo of a man realizing that the woman he had turned out into the road had just quietly saved the very land he'd taken from her, though he had done nothing whatsoever to deserve it. The gold dust and coin in the tin box, Judge Pruitt ruled, belonged rightfully to the cooperative and its surviving members, to be distributed, at Thessaly's own recommendation, not as a windfall to be pocketed, but as a fund to rebuild the Icehouse itself and reopen the cooperative for good, so that Larkspur Hollow might once more have what Obadiah Finch had built it to have, a way for ordinary families to weather hard winters together instead of alone. Cornelius Vane did not go to prison, for the law of the territory in those years was not built to punish men of his particular polish so severely, but he lost, in a single afternoon, the trust of every family whose mortgage his bank still held, and within 2 years he had sold his interests and left the valley altogether, a quiet exile that Thessaly, who never once raised her voice against him even in victory, considered justice enough. And so we return, as we promised we would, to where this story began, to a 34-year-old widow standing at a crossroads with $11 to her name, buying for 5 of them a ruin that an entire town had already decided was worthless. It would have been easy, that first day on the boardwalk with Ferris Dunmore's laughter still hanging in the air, for Thessaly Rourke to believe what the town believed about her, that she was a woman of poor judgment, chasing a foolish comfort in the wreck of something already lost. But we have told you her story now, and you understand, as she always somehow understood, that the true measure of a thing was never in what a careless crowd was willing to pay for it, but in what a patient woman was willing to look for inside it. The Icehouse itself still stands in Larkspur Hollow today, rebuilt board by careful board, its rafters sound, its ledger, the original, alongside the new ones Thessaly herself began to keep. Held safe in a fireproof box the cooperative purchased with its very first restored dividend. She never remarried, and she never needed to, for she had found, in that forgotten building and the secret it had kept faithfully for 11 years, something larger than any single household. A whole community handed back to itself, and a name, her own, that would not be forgotten after all. Thank you for spending this quiet hour with us, and with Thessaly Rourke. If her story moved you, we would be glad if you shared it with someone who needs to hear that overlooked things are so very rarely worthless. And we would love to know, in the comments below, of a time in your own life when you found real value in something the world around you had already written off. Until next time, stay close.